One of the most important parts of world building is creating our character's belief system. Fortunately, this is also my favorite part. My process of making this belief system started with forming a single philosophy central to Tala and her clan's everyday life. This philosophy was, we are prey as much as we are predators. Hunt or be hunted. In an objectively dangerous world where our characters have to hunt to survive, they elevate the relationship between the prey and the predator and create a cylindrical dichotomy, personifying it with two gods, the hunter and the wild hunter. One represents the human, prosperity and being the hunter, and the other represents the wild, starvation and being hunted. By separating their world philosophy into us, the humans, and them, the rest of the world, animals and nature, it not only sets our humans up to being the center of their universe for the next millennia, but also begins to set up their human identity and a sense of camaraderie between other nomad clans they may meet. Let's talk about the primary god of our nomads and other clans in our prehistoric world. In this world, humanity is entirely nomadic, and so their gods travel with them. So, this section of the world largely follows the same belief in this hunter god. However, there are many versions of this god that can change from nomad to nomad. Known as the hunter, firekeeper, protector, and guide, this god represents humanity, well-being, and plenty. Everything positive that ever happens in our nomads' lives is attributed to him, and his nebulous characterization only makes him easier to adapt to each different clan. The only really consistent thing about him is that he is a great hunter, gifting his followers with herds of animals so that they may hunt them themselves. But as excellent a hunter he is, the guide is always himself hunted by the wild one, the embodiment of humanity's greatest predator. The Wild One, or Huntress, is our nomad's evil god, and the sole one blamed for any and all misfortune that may happen to our nomads. Be it a bad hunt or a drought, it is all her fault. And this convenient scapegoat aspect of her characterization means that she isn't forgotten by those who believe in her, which is good because simply saying any of her names might draw her attention to you, and with it, her misfortune. The Huntress is an old god, far older than the hunter, originating from an ancient skull god that itself was brought into being from an ancient prehistoric saber-toothed cat. Based on the Dinophilus, this ancient predator hunted hominids until it was hunted to extinction, and from its existence and extinction came a reverence and worship from the very creatures who killed it. But it's important to note that the god currently worshipped by our nomads is no longer the god that was once feared and revered by its hominid cultists. Our nomad's god is a shadow, a half-forgotten memory that, while still feared and remembered, is rapidly fading away from what it once was. An important thing to remember with cultural beliefs and rituals is that they play a role in everyday life, and in the case of our nomads, a lot of their daily customs come from their belief in their hunter and wild gods. The circle and eye symbols are common iconography here. The circle is carved into weapons to bless them for hunting, and all ephemeral trinkets and objects our nomads collect are used as offerings for a variety of different reasons, such as to decorate graves or as small sacrifices for good weather or safe travel. Handcrafted statuettes are also important. Small replicas of the hunter god are carried with our nomads and are sacrificed and prayed to for safe travels and good hunts, and it's constantly draped in trinkets. Part 2 of simple rituals. Let's go. So, moving on to rituals around our hunter god, it's important to note that our wild god is a lot more obscure and terrifying than the hunter god. While open worship is encouraged with one, the other is hardly mentioned at all out of fear that you might get its attention. The eye is a symbol of that fear, seen as watching the viewer. And so our nomads use a mix of charcoal, tallow, and ochre placed under the eyes to protect themselves from the wild god's gaze. The wild god is essentially the forces of nature, and so bargaining with her is something often done, but with little success. However, her favor is something that can't be bought with trinkets, so sacrifices are the only other reasonable option. The kind of sacrifice, you ask, depends on how desperate you are. So, one of the coolest parts of cave art is that there are actually a lot of symbols and signs that appear throughout a lot of ancient artworks that can date symbology back to as far as between 100,000 and 40,000 years ago. So while it's important to note that in real life, these symbols are not decoded, translated, or even fully understood conceptually, I took this idea of symbols and absolutely ran with it. Keeping it basic, I created a simple series of pictographs that represent markers, directions, and warnings, but of them all, all, the most important are these. The simple tracing of the hand means I am here, safe, home, an acknowledgement of the self and their presence, and an assurance to all that find them. A simple circle, either hollow or filled in, represents the hunter god, prosperity and goodness. These can be found painted around shelters, on the bark of fruit trees, and on the handles of weapons. Lastly, the eye represents danger, predators, and the wild god. The eye is a warning to all who see it to get out immediately. In many ways, the most somber, significant, and ritualistic parts of a human life is when it ends. And for our nomads, it marks the point when their lives are taken by the wild god. When our nomads die, their spirits ascend to join the stars with other constellations, but their bodies are left behind to be buried and protected by their loved ones. When buried, the bodies are posed in the fetal position on their side in a round dug grave and placed in a bed of ash, grass, and insect-repelling plants, like the beds of the living. The deceased are buried with their weapons and small luxuries such as their cloaks. Cooked food is placed in the mouth as a last meal. Their faces are completely painted, over the eyes especially. Their loved ones each place offerings in the form of their trinkets and beads. The graves are not dug very deep, and so to completely entomb the bodies, they are covered in stones and rocks, leaving mounds as markers for where they lie. If the body is not properly prepared, their spirit... Music. It's some of the most incredible human creations, a source of joy and feeling that move the soul and heart, and is one of the things that make us truly human. So, let's compose the soundtrack for our prehistoric Pleistocene society. Unfortunately, in real life, there is very little confirmed about instruments, with our earliest instrument being a small bone flute dating to 60,000 years ago. Although whether or not this is actually a flute is a matter of debate. So, let's say it is. That would give our nomads access to simple bone flutes. They also could have had makeshift drums or used simple things like the handles of their tools knocking against each other or on the ground to keep a beat. But I feel the main source of music for our nomads should be the voice. Singing, humming, and whistling, imitating wildlife and forming communal, informal choruses. Humming while traveling long distances and shaping a sense of community and harmony through the sheer emotion that song can bring. Now, I've talked over the big overarching beliefs of our nomads world, but the grand scale stuff is not the only superstitions our nomads would have held. They live in a world without science, without understanding how the sun rises and sets, why storms come and go, why there are fires in the dry season, and why some rocks make sparks and sometimes their loved ones get terribly sick for no discernible reason. When their world seems scary and unexplainable, people have always looked for answers to it, and in lieu of scientific explanations, they find their own. Why does the sun rise and set? Because the filament itself is an ever-turning cloth. Alone in the forest, there's something unseeable watching you. A cave you've settled in makes eerie noises when the wind blows into it. It's haunted by a demon. You glance something moving out the corner of your eye. It might be a spirit or the wild god itself. Superstitions feast on human imagination, and this makes the entire world a fantastical and hauntingly terrifying place.